If you have a PlayStation 5 sitting under your TV right now and you haven't touched the 16 games on this list, you are basically using a powerhouse console as an oversized paperweight. I absolutely refuse to let you keep doing that. Seriously, put your backlog out of your mind for a minute. We all have that massive list of shame anyway. I get it. It doesn't matter if you're totally strapped for cash or if you're a veteran who thinks they've already played everything worth playing this generation. Every single title we are looking at today justifies the price tag and completely respects your time. They actually push the hardware, they completely nail the immersion, and I am going to show you exactly why you need to drop whatever you're doing and boot them up immediately. Alright, let's talk about Stellar Blade. I am going to be completely honest. When the first trailers dropped, I totally wrote this off as pure style over substance. I figured it was going to be a gorgeous tech demo with incredibly shallow combat. I could not have been more wrong. You play as Eve, dropping down to a ruined Earth to wipe out these grotesque, deeply unsettling horrors called the Nighttiba. The enemy design is genuinely skin-crawling, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is where this completely hooks you. It is a masterclass in kinetic, aggressive action. It plays less like a standard hack and slash and way more like a high-stakes rhythm game. You are constantly managing dodges, reading enemy telegraphs, and hunting for that exact parry window. And when you finally nail that perfect deflection, the visual sparks, the metallic clank of the sound design, the sheer weight of the impact, it delivers a massive hit of dopamine every single time. Look, nobody is winning any awards for the writing here. The plot definitely takes a back seat. But you don't boot this up for a deep philosophical narrative. You play it because tearing through a massive, multi-phase boss fight that takes you 2 grueling hours to memorize and beat feels absolutely incredible. It is pure, unfiltered gameplay mastery, making you feel like an absolute weapon. There's this weird narrative floating around that Spider-Man Miles Morales was basically an overpriced expansion pack, and that is completely, fundamentally incorrect. Sure, the runtime is tighter than Peter's original outing, but honestly, the pacing benefits so much from that. Miles is not a seasoned pro with a decade of crime fighting under his belt. He's an anxious teenager trying to balance his real life in Harlem with suddenly having the weight of the city on his shoulders, and the writing genuinely nails that coming-of-age vulnerability. But where this Hane actually rewrites the playbook is the combat loop. The introduction of his bioelectric venom strikes completely disrupts the flow you got used to in the first game. You are doing way more than just dodging, punching. You are actively managing area of effect crowd control, chaining together these massive screen-clearing electrical bursts that have incredible impact frames and crunching sound design. And we absolutely have to talk about the traversal. The animation team went incredibly hard showing his lack of experience. He flails in the air, he catches himself clumsily, but the momentum flows beautifully. Add in the absolute vibe of swinging through a snow-covered New York during the holidays, and you have an incredibly dense, zero-fillers cinematic experience. Alright, now we need to talk about Returnal, because this game is an absolute meat grinder and I am entirely obsessed with it. You play as Celine, an Astra Scout trapped in a brutal cyclical nightmare on the hostile planet of Atropos. Every single time you die, and trust me, you are going to die a lot, the entire biome reshuffles. We are talking full procedural generation, where the enemy spawns, the room layouts, and the weapon drops completely randomize. I know that roguelike loop sounds exhausting, especially when you lose a 2-hour run, but Housemarque absolutely nailed the combat pacing. It is a perfectly tuned, high-octane bullet hell where your dash has these glorious invincibility frames. You're constantly weaving through massive neon arrays of enemy fire while managing your weapon cooldowns. The learning curve is basically a brick wall. I spent literal days getting absolutely filtered by some of these bosses, but the moment the movement mechanics finally click, it induces this pure flow state that is unmatched on the console. Plus, we absolutely have to acknowledge the hardware integration. The DualSense haptics are so incredibly dialed in that you can actually feel the individual raindrops tapping against your palms, and the adaptive triggers completely change how you manage your alternate firing modes. The narrative is this dark psychological sci-fi mindbender, and eventually clearing a biome gives you the biggest adrenaline dump imaginable. Alright, we are leaving Tsushima behind and jumping forward to 1603, right into the shadow of Mount Yote. And man, Sucker Punch absolutely cooked with this one. We have a completely new protagonist named Atsu, and she is an entirely different beast than Jin. She has this relentless, almost vindictive fighting style that makes every single encounter feel incredibly visceral. The combat animations have been totally overhauled. The parry windows feel tighter, the stealth takedowns are significantly more fluid, and the lethal swordplay has this heavy, grounded realism to it that I absolutely crave in a single-player experience. You are not fighting glowing fantasy monsters here, just pure, skill-based samurai duels that demand your full attention. And we have to talk about the visual fidelity, because when I was reviewing my capture footage in the editing timeline, it genuinely looked pre-rendered. The wind tech they pioneered in the first game is dialed up to 11. You are riding through these wildly dense forests and massive fields of wildflowers that react dynamically to the weather, with the snowy peaks dominating the skyline. But the most impressive part? The optimization. The engine handles all of those complex particle effects without dropping frames or suffering from any of that annoying traversal stutter that absolutely ruins immersion in so many modern open worlds. The narrative hooks you instantly, the presentation is flawless, and it takes an already masterful formula and completely refines the combat loop. We absolutely have to talk about the game that basically set the modern gold standard for open world design, Ghost of Tsushima. You step into the muddy boots of Jin Sakai, right as his entire way of life is getting violently dismantled by the Mongol invasion. The central conflict here is brilliant because Jin is forced to completely abandon his honorable samurai code and adopt these brutal, terrifying guerrilla tactics just to survive. And the gameplay loop perfectly reflects that internal struggle. Sucker Punch gives you complete agency over the sandbox. If you want to walk straight up to a Mongol camp and trigger a cinematic standoff, you can do that. And man, the standoff mechanic is an absolute masterclass in tension. Waiting for that exact frame to release your strike, the blood spray, the sheer weight of the katana slicing through armor, it feels incredibly grounded and lethal. Or you can stick to the shadows and systematically dismantle the enemy AI with kunai and stealth takedowns. The animations are so buttery smooth, and what I really appreciate is that it stays completely rooted in reality. No supernatural nonsense, just raw, tactical combat. Then you factor in the director's cut with the Iki Island expansion, and the difficulty curve takes a massive spike. The new enemy types, especially those shamans that buff the heavy brutes, force you to constantly switch up your combat stances on the fly, or you will get punished. But the absolute genius of this game is the UI, or really, the lack of it. Having the physical wind guide you to your next objective instead of staring at some cluttered minimap is a massive game changer for immersion. I spend a ridiculous amount of time just scrubbing through my capture footage because every single frame of this game looks like a Kurosawa film. The particle effects with the falling leaves, the lighting engine, and the fact that it runs at a completely locked, flawless frame rate without any of those miserable traversal stutters that plague so many modern releases, it is just a technical marvel. If you only have time to play one historical action game, you owe it to yourself to experience Jin's story. It is a genuine 10 out of 10, and I mean that sincerely. Alright, so I am going to be totally transparent with you guys. You know, my channel usually focuses on grounded, realistic games. Heavy fantasy and supernatural stuff usually makes me bounce right off. I had basically given up on the Final Fantasy franchise for years. But then, Final Fantasy 16 comes along, and Square Enix essentially pitches a gritty, dark political thriller that just happens to feature massive kaiju battles. I was instantly hooked. You play as Clive Rossfield, and man, the developers put this guy through the absolute ringer. The prologue alone is a masterclass in pacing and tragedy. But instead of just brooding in a corner, Clive channels all that trauma into aggressively dismantling the literal gods of this world. We absolutely have to talk about the combat mechanics, because they brought in Ryota Suzuki, the combat director from Devil May Cry 5, and his DNA is all over this game. You are not just mashing an attack button, you are managing ability cooldowns, weaving magic bursts perfectly between your sword strikes, and animation canceling your way into these massive, incredibly satisfying aerial juggles. The stagger meter forces you to play aggressively, and when you finally break an enemy's posture and unload all your iconic abilities at once, the visual feedback is insane. I was scrubbing through my capture footage in my editing timeline, and the screen is literally flooded with fire and lightning, yet the action feels completely responsive and heavy. Then there are the icon fights. You are controlling skyscraper-sized monsters, physically ripping each other apart, throwing each other through mountains in real time. It completely pushes the hardware to its absolute limit, delivering a cinematic spectacle that genuinely leaves you sitting there with your jaw on the floor. I know some of the old school purists are completely furious that it abandoned the traditional turn based combat. Honestly, they need to let it go. This high octane action direction works phenomenally well for the brutal tone they established. Plus, you get a loyal hound named Torgal who fights alongside you. You can manually command him to extend your combos. And yes, you can pet him. That alone makes it a 10 out of 10 in my book. I know exactly what some of you are typing in the comments right now. You are looking at the screen wondering why the guy who usually obsesses over narrative single-player games is suddenly covering a track racer. Let me stop you right there, because Gran Turismo 7 completely bridges that gap. If you think this is simply cars driving in circles, you are severely underestimating what Polyphony Digital pulled off here. This is fundamentally a massive RPG where the vehicles are your characters. You start out in some absolute beater of a compact car, grinding out Sunday cups, and slowly, meticulously building a garage full of multi-million-dollar hypercars. And the physics engine, it is genuinely absurd. You can actually feel the weight transfer when you dive into a corner. Taking a lightweight Japanese tuner out on the track feels entirely different than trying to wrestle a massive, heavy American muscle car through a hairpin. The simulation is so incredibly dialed in, right down to the tire friction models and suspension geometry, that actual professional GT drivers use this software for track memorization. That is a documented fact. Now, as a massive nerd for optimization and hardware, I have to talk about the PS5 integration. The DualSense implementation here is literally industry-defining. You can feel the exact moment your rear tires lose traction through the haptic feedback vibrating in your palms. When you slam on the brakes, the adaptive triggers physically push back against your fingers to simulate the ABS pumping. Combine that with a completely rock-solid frame rate, none of that infuriating stutter you see in modern open-world racers, and dynamic weather systems that physically change the track surface temperature and grip levels mid-race. It is unmatched for pure immersion. Look, we all know the launch was incredibly messy with that whole microtransaction economy balancing disaster. They fumbled that hard. But they've spent the last couple of years heavily patching and rebalancing the progression, and what we are left with today is arguably the most polished, graphically stunning driving simulator on the market. Even if you do not know the first thing about horsepower or gear ratios, the sheer mechanical polish of this game will convert you into a gearhead. It is absolutely a 10 out of 10, even though I have definitely put my expensive hypercars straight into the retaining wall more times than I'm willing to admit on camera. Okay, paint this picture in your head. The world completely collapsed, humanity basically hit the reset button, and thousands of years later, we are back to tribal societies using primitive weapons. Oh, and the entire ecosystem has been completely taken over by massively complex, highly aggressive robotic dinosaurs. You step back into the boots of Aloy, and this time she is pushing into the ruined, overgrown remains of the western United States. And I have to tell you, looking at my raw capture footage and the editing timeline, the Decima engine is doing some absolute black magic here. The visual fidelity is staggering. We are talking perfectly rendered dense jungles where the foliage dynamically reacts to your movement, terrifyingly deep underwater segments through the flooded neon ruins of Las Vegas, and completely seamless transitions between scorching deserts and heavy snowstorms. But where this game completely consumes my time is the combat loop. The enemy design in Forbidden West is a massive step up from the first game. The first time I triggered an encounter with a slither fang, this colossal mechanical cobra that literally dives and swims through the desert sand, my jaw actually hit the floor. This is a game that demands your full attention. You cannot just spam light attacks and expect to survive. The combat is an incredibly deep, high-stakes tactical puzzle. You are constantly scanning for elemental weaknesses, managing your weapon wheel, and meticulously aiming for individual armor plates to expose the critical components underneath. The sound design when you successfully tear off a heavy weapon from a machine, the sheer mechanical crunch of it is so incredibly satisfying. Plus, the optimization is fantastic, which you guys know I completely obsess over. Running this in performance mode gives you butter-smooth frame pacing without any of that miserable traversal stutter when you're sprinting across the massive map. The sci-fi lore can definitely get a little dense and overwhelming, but if you love highly polished, incredibly immersive single-player action, this is an absolute triumph. Easy 10 out of 10. If anyone ever asks me to justify the hardware inside the PS5, I am not booting up some hyper-realistic military sim. I immediately hand them the controller for Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Insomniac Games essentially engineered a playable Pixar movie, and I do not use that comparison lightly. The squash and stretch animation work on the character models is flawless, and the ray trace reflections constantly bouncing off Clank's metallic chassis look completely absurd in motion. But the actual sorcery here is the engine's real-time asset streaming. The way it leverages the NVMe SSD completely shatters the old rules of level design. You are literally tethering yourself to dimensional tears and instantly pulling your character from a dense, neon-drenched cyberpunk metropolis straight into a massive pirate-infested swamp. Zero loading screens, zero hiding behind tight corridors. It happens in literal milliseconds. The campaign perfectly splits your time between Ratchet and an incredible new Lombax protagonist named Rivet, and the combat loop they share is pure chaotic dopamine. You are managing this massive wheel of ridiculous weaponry, deploying topiary sprinklers that dynamically overgrow enemies with high-resolution foliage, and managing crowd control while dodging heavily telegraphed laser grids. And the DualSense integration is a total game changer for the gunplay. The adaptive triggers actually have physical resistance stops built in. A half pull gives you one precise firing mode, and pushing past that tension unleashes a completely different secondary fire. As someone who hyper-analyzes optimization and absolutely despises frame drops, watching this game handle dozens of enemies, insanely dense particle physics, and reality-bending portals while staying completely locked at a butter-smooth 60 frames per second in performance mode is genuinely mind-blowing. Even if you normally strictly play ultra-grounded, serious titles, you absolutely cannot ignore this level of pure mechanical perfection. It is an easy 10 out of 10, zero debate. I am going to be totally transparent with you guys right out of the gate. Yes, The Last of Us Part 1 is a ground-up remake of a game that we already bought on the PS3 and then bought again as a remaster on the PS4. I completely understand the frustration over that full price tag. But if you have somehow managed to avoid playing this absolute masterpiece, or if you simply want to see what the current hardware can actually do with a tightly focused linear narrative experience, this is undeniably the definitive version. You step into the heavy boots of Joel, this deeply cynical, brutally hardened survivor who I honestly relate to on a spiritual level, and you are forced into smuggling a fiercely independent teenage girl named Ellie across a quarantined, totally collapsed United States. The technical leap from the original release to this version is genuinely staggering. Naughty Dog did not simply bump up the resolution, they completely rebuilt the entire game using their modern engine. The volumetric lighting pushing through the dust in these ruined, overgrown quarantine zones is completely gorgeous. But the real magic is in the completely overhauled character models. You can actually see the micro-expressions during the cinematics now, the subtle eye movements, the way a jaw physically clenches when a character is trying to hide their fear. It completely elevates the emotional weight of Joel and Ellie's arc. You watch this deeply reluctant, emotionally walled-off guy slowly drop his guard over dozens of hours of brutal survival, and I am entirely willing to admit that the late-game sequences had my eyes sweating profusely. And we absolutely have to talk about the combat loop, because the tension is on an entirely different level. They took the heavily upgraded enemy AI and retrofitted it into these classic encounters. Human enemies will actively coordinate, flank your position, and flush you out, forcing you to constantly break stealth and scramble for extremely limited resources. And the infected encounters? Terrifying. When you are crouched behind a desk in a pitch-black subway tunnel and you hear a clicker using its echolocation to hunt you down, leveraging the PS5's 3D audio to hear exactly where that horrifying clicking sound is coming from in the dark is absolutely heart-stopping. Every single punch Joel throws, every swing of a modified melee weapon, carries this heavy, desperate, incredibly grounded weight. It is a grueling, perfectly paced, flawlessly optimized survival horror experience. Easy 10 out of 10. Alright, we need to have a very honest conversation about Death Stranding 2 on the beach. You guys know my tastes by now. I heavily prefer grounded, realistic, systems-driven experiences. So a completely unhinged sci-fi narrative directed by Hideo Kojima, featuring floating supernatural entities, massive oceans of tar, and incredibly dense existential dread should realistically push me completely away. But the absolute madman actually pulled me right back in. The first game was famously dismissed by a lot of people as a glorified mailman simulator, yet somehow, meticulously managing the physics of a delivery route across a fractured continent ended up being one of the most mechanically addictive loops of that entire console generation. Now, the sequel takes that foundational terrain traversal and completely shatters the scale. You are back in the incredibly worn out boots of Sam Porter Bridges, but the isolation of the original has evolved into something much larger. We are looking at massive new geographical regions, a fully stacked Hollywood cast delivering these incredibly heavy cinematic performances, and significantly more direct, aggressive action set pieces. But the real star of the show remains the environmental physics. When you are planning an expedition, you are not simply slapping a waypoint on a minimap and holding the sprint button. You are actively analyzing topographical UI, managing the literal center of gravity on your cargo frame, and reading the ground beneath your boots. Every single loose rock, every rushing river, and every muddy incline is a physical, tactical puzzle that threatens to destroy your momentum. The Decima engine is pushing the PS5 hardware to a genuinely absurd degree here. The photogrammetry on the landscapes is so hyper-realistic that when the dynamic weather suddenly shifts from a dead silent, gorgeous sweeping valley to a pitch-black supernatural storm, the atmosphere is actually suffocating. And yes, the narrative goes entirely off the rails. You will regularly finish a massive cutscene, pause your game, and just stare blankly at your monitor, trying to process the absolute fever dream you just witnessed. But that friction is exactly why it works. You spend an hour agonizing over your equipment weight limits and stamina management, only to be thrown into a mind-bending cinematic survival sequence. It is an incredibly divisive loop, and I fully acknowledge that the deliberate pacing is not for everyone. But if you want a massive, visually flawless experience that completely rewrites how player movement and environmental hostility function in a video game, this is an absolute masterpiece. 10 out of 10, even if I still need a dedicated whiteboard to understand half the plot. If Insomniac Games did not already prove they completely own the superhero genre, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 absolutely seals the deal. They essentially took the rock-solid mechanical foundation of Peter's first game, combined it with the kinetic energy of the Miles Morales spin-off, and engineered an absolute powerhouse of a sequel. This time around, you are hot-swapping between both Spider-Mans seamlessly on the fly. Thanks to the hardware, that character transition happens in literal milliseconds without a single loading screen interrupting your flow. Mechanically, managing both protagonists completely changes the combat rhythm. Miles still brings that incredible bioelectric area of effect crowd control, but Peter getting the alien symbiote suit makes him an entirely different beast. The combat animations shift dramatically. You stop feeling like a nimble acrobat and start fighting like an absolute bruiser, slamming heavy brute enemies into the pavement with these massive, wildly aggressive tendril attacks. The parry system they introduced adds a fantastic layer of risk-reward to the encounters too, and the narrative totally leans into that raw aggression. You watch the suit slowly corrupt Peter's mind, making him deeply reckless and genuinely cruel to his closest allies. It gets incredibly dark and deeply uncomfortable to witness his psychological decline. Throw Kraven the Hunter into the mix as this massive, unrelenting physical threat who is systematically dismantling the city's rogue gallery, and eventually Venom himself, and the pacing simply never lets up. But I absolutely have to talk about the traversal. They massively expanded the map geometry to include Queens and Brooklyn, and to compensate, they introduced the web wings. Combining the traditional pendulum physics of web swinging with seamlessly transitioning into a glide through city wind tunnels creates this unmatched, addictive flow state. I completely ignored the main quest for hours on end just doing laps around the skyline, because the momentum system is so perfectly tuned. And you guys know how much I obsess over performance. Watching this engine render a massively dense, fully populated New York City at completely breakneck traversal speeds without a single dropped frame or stutter is absolute technical magic. The boss fights are massive cinematic set pieces, the engine polish is flawless, and I honestly need the third game in my hands right now. Absolute 10 out of 10. We absolutely need to talk about the grandfather of the entire genre, Demon Souls. Now, you guys know my tastes. I usually completely avoid heavy, dark fantasy and supernatural stuff. I want my games heavily grounded in reality. But what Bluepoint Games pulled off with this PS5 remake is a technical masterpiece that is physically impossible to ignore. Before every single developer decided to make punishingly brutal action RPGs, this was the blueprint, and the visual upgrade they delivered is frankly absurd. They took a deeply oppressive, bleak PS3 classic and rebuilt every single brick, texture, and enemy animation from scratch, turning it into arguably the best-looking launch title we have ever seen. The core gameplay loop is pure, unforgiving trial and error. You are dropped into Boletaria, and the environment explicitly wants to destroy you. You are going to die constantly. But the combat mechanics are incredibly deliberate and heavy. Every single sword swing carries massive weight. You are meticulously managing your stamina bar, reading subtle enemy telegraphs, and hunting for exact parry windows. When you perfectly deflect a heavy knight strike and trigger a riposte, the entirely overhauled sound design and the DualSense haptic feedback make you feel the raw, metallic crunch of the impact in your hands. And because you are dying so often, we have to talk about the SSD optimization. On the old hardware, a death meant sitting through agonizing loading screens that completely killed the pacing. Here, you die and the engine throws you instantly right back to the Archstone in literal milliseconds. It keeps you locked into that frustrating but totally addictive flow state. There are no floating objective markers, no cluttered UI guiding you. You are forced to physically memorize the hostile level architecture and find those massive game-changing shortcuts. Even the darkest, most miserable swamps look completely stunning with the new volumetric lighting. When you finally memorize a boss pattern and beat an encounter that walled you for hours, the pure adrenaline dump is unmatched. It is a grueling, perfectly optimized masterpiece. 10 out of 10, and yes, that Vanguard demon in the tutorial is absolutely going to flatten you. That is just part of the initiation. I usually run far, far away from massive, heavy fantasy JRPGs with supernatural elements. Give me a grounded, gritty, perfectly optimized single-player experience any day of the week. But Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is frankly one of the most mechanically ambitious open-world projects I have pulled capture footage for in a very long time. We are finally breaking out of the linear, claustrophobic steel corridors of Midgar, and the sheer scale of the map they drop you into is entirely overwhelming. Square Enix completely avoided building a massive empty sandbox. You are seamlessly crossing from the dense, heavily detailed grasslands straight into these massive canyons and incredibly dense swamps. And I ended up completely torching my editing schedule because I got entirely sidetracked inside the Gold Saucer, which is essentially a massive physics-heavy theme park running flawlessly inside an already gigantic game. But the combat loop is what completely hooks my systems-driven brain. It is this incredibly deep hybrid system. You are physically controlling Cloud, managing real-time dodges and hunting for perfect parries with the Buster Sword. But the absolute genius is the active time battle gauge. You are physically freezing the action, analyzing enemy weaknesses, and meticulously commanding your entire party to execute specific elemental synergies and massive stagger combos. Every single encounter is a high-stakes tactical puzzle. And the party AI is actually fantastic. Getting to run the open world with Aerith, Tifa, Barret, and Red 13, and listening to their incredibly well-written dynamic banter during the exploration phase makes you deeply invested in the crew. If you grew up knowing the legacy of the original release, there is this massive, unavoidable knot of anxiety sitting in your stomach the entire runtime, just waiting for the narrative shoe to drop. I am absolutely not going to spoil a single frame of that wildly divisive third act, but I will freely admit the finale had me completely losing my mind and shouting at my monitor. It is an absolute technical and narrative behemoth. Easy 10 out of 10. Do yourself a massive favor and mute your keywords online so nobody ruins this experience for you. God of War Ragnarok fundamentally embarrasses almost every other action game on the market. You are stepping back into the incredibly heavy boots of Kratos, who is still the most intensely intimidating father figure in gaming history, and dealing with Atreus, who is going through absolute peak teenage rebellion. Except his rebellion involves apocalyptic mythological prophecies that threaten to unmake the entire world. The pacing in this campaign is an absolute masterclass. You will be sitting here trying to process a wildly massive screen-shaking set piece that pushes the rendering engine to its absolute limit, and then 5 minutes later, the camera pulls in close for this incredibly quiet, brutally raw conversation between a father and son that genuinely hits you right in the chest. Mechanically, the combat loop is so incredibly visceral. The Leviathan axe still has the most satisfying recall physics ever coded into a video game, but when you factor in the Blades of Chaos for wide area of effect crowd control and introduce the new weapon you get later in the game, the entire combo system completely opens up. Every single shield bash, every heavy runic attack, carries this massive grounded weight that translates perfectly through the haptics. And we absolutely have to talk about the world design. They actually open up all 9 realms this time, and the transition between these massively distinct biomes is handled flawlessly by the engine. Zero annoying traversal stutter, just pure locked-in performance. I also almost never praise side content, but the optional favors here, especially the incredible dynamic dialogue with the dwarf brothers Brock and Sindri, are basically main quest quality. Some of the late-game hidden biomes, like the crater in Vanaheim, are massive chunks of the map completely dedicated to incredible boss fights and deep character development. It is a perfectly polished masterpiece that people will be dissecting for the next decade. Easy 10 out of 10. We are closing out this video with something completely out of left field for this channel, Astrobot. You guys know my track record. I am notoriously critical, I obsess over hyper-realistic graphics, and I complain endlessly about engine optimization and traversal stutters in heavily grounded, serious single-player titles. I am basically the last person on Earth you would expect to be reviewing a colorful, mascot-driven 3D platformer. But Team Asobi managed to break through every single wall of cynicism I have built up, and I spent an 8-hour playthrough grinning at my monitor like an absolute child on Christmas morning. The sheer volume of mechanical creativity on display here is frankly staggering. We all know the standard industry formula. A studio comes up with 2, maybe 3 solid gameplay loops, and then artificially stretches them across a bloated 40-hour campaign map to justify a price tag. Astrobot completely ignores that model. Every single isolated level introduces an entirely bespoke physics mechanic, pushes it to its absolute maximum potential, and then immediately throws it away to give you something totally new. One minute, you are dynamically shrinking down to the size of a microchip to navigate completely different collision geometry. The next, you are utilizing a massive sponge mechanic that physically alters your jump trajectory and momentum based on actual water absorption. Then the game casually hands you a robotic jetpack or has you utilizing physics-based grapple swings like a metallic monkey. The game engine is just constantly throwing flawlessly executed concepts at you without ever recycling its own ideas, and that pacing is insanely rare. As a massive hardware nerd, I absolutely have to talk about the DualSense haptic feedback. This isn't some cheap rumble gimmick. It is an incredibly dense layer of sensory immersion. The actuators in the controller are tuned so precisely that you can physically feel the textural difference between your metallic feet hitting shattered glass versus walking across loose, granular sand. You can actually feel the directional resistance of the wind pushing against your character through your palms. Plus, if you have any history with the PlayStation ecosystem, the sheer density of incredibly well-animated legacy character cameos acting as collectibles constantly rewards your exploration. Every corner you turn feels like opening a tiny time capsule of gaming history. There are no sprawling skill trees here, no incredibly dark and brooding narrative arcs, and absolutely zero performance drops. It is pure, mechanically flawless, heavily optimized dopamine. If you own the current generation hardware and you are actively ignoring this release, you are genuinely making a massive mistake. It is an undeniable 10 out of 10, arguably the tightest platforming experience developed in the last 20 years, and that is coming from a guy who notoriously hates being happy.